On a cool October evening in 2005, a British Airways Airbus A319 prepared to leave London Heathrow for Budapest. By the end of this story, investigators would uncover why a flight that began like thousands before it briefly left two experienced pilots trying to understand an aircraft that was no longer giving them the information they depended on. The answers would not come quickly, because the first clues appeared long before anyone realized they mattered. Unknown to the crew, a fault within the aircraft's electrical system had already begun developing. Nothing in the cockpit suggested it yet. Every indication pointed toward another normal flight. In the cockpit was an experienced captain with thousands of hours on Airbus aircraft, alongside a first officer early in her airline career. Like every professional crew, they entered the flight expecting the aircraft to communicate clearly when decisions mattered most. They relied on training, procedures, and technology designed to provide accurate information at every stage of the journey. For those first minutes after departure, everything followed the familiar rhythm of a normal flight. The aircraft was behaving as expected, the workload was controlled, and nothing suggested how quickly that confidence would disappear. For the pilots, the flight had entered the most routine phase of any departure, the moment when attention shifts from takeoff to the journey ahead. The Airbus moved through Heathrow's busy taxiways before accelerating into the night sky. As it climbed above southeast England, the autopilot was engaged, air traffic control cleared the aircraft higher, and the crew reviewed the weather waiting in Budapest. Then, only minutes after departure, that certainty vanished. A heavy mechanical sound interrupted the climb. Almost instantly, the electronic displays the pilots depended on went dark. The aircraft was still flying, but the information it provided had suddenly disappeared. The investigation would eventually identify the component that failed. The deeper question was why one hidden fault had managed to silence so many systems designed to help pilots understand their aircraft. The sudden blackout transformed a routine climb into an unfamiliar emergency. The captain's first priority was not discovering the cause. It was controlling the aircraft. With the autopilot unavailable, he took manual control while the crew worked to determine which systems were still reliable. Outside the windshield, the night sky became their most dependable reference. Inside the cockpit, the instruments that normally confirmed every action had either disappeared or become difficult to interpret. For the passengers, the climb continued without any obvious sign of trouble. For the two pilots, the aircraft they trusted to provide constant information had suddenly gone silent. The first officer began assessing what remained. The engines were still producing thrust, and the aircraft continued climbing. But those answers only created more uncertainty. What had actually failed? And which information could still be trusted? Communication soon became another challenge. While attempting to contact air traffic control, the captain accidentally pressed the autopilot disconnect button instead of the radio transmit switch. It was a small mistake, but one that showed how quickly a familiar cockpit environment had changed. After correcting the error, there was still no response. The radios had also been affected. To controllers on the ground, the aircraft had stopped responding normally. They knew something had happened, but they could not see the problem. Inside the cockpit, the crew moved carefully through the emergency procedure. Without normal headset communication, they had to raise their voices above the background noise while confirming each action. Within the emergency procedure was a step the pilots hoped would restore more than just the displays. But bringing the cockpit back to life would not answer the question they needed answered most. Why had it happened? A single action brought electrical power back. The cockpit displays illuminated, essential instruments returned. The immediate emergency appeared to be fatting. But the aircraft had regained power. The crew had not yet regained certainty. One action restored electrical power, and with it came an immediate sense of relief. The cockpit displays illuminated, essential flight instruments returned, the autopilot became available again. For the first time since the blackout began, the crew could clearly see what the aircraft was doing. It felt like the emergency was ending. But the most important question remained unanswered. What had caused it? The captain stabilized the aircraft at the last altitude assigned by air traffic control before declaring a pan call. Controllers, relieved to hear the aircraft again, cleared the flight to remain over eastern England while the crew evaluated their options. Rather than continuing toward Budapest, the captain requested a holding pattern. Time had become one of their most valuable resources. Before sending the aircraft across Europe again, they needed confidence that the situation had truly been evaluated. As the crew reviewed the remaining indications, they discovered that not everything had returned to normal. Automatic thrust remained unavailable. One electrical unit continued showing a fault. The captain's windshield heating and several secondary systems were still affected. None of these issues alone explained the complete blackout. Together, they suggested something more complicated. The captain contacted British Airways Maintenance Control. Hopping engineers on the ground could help identify the failure. But the information reaching them was incomplete. The pilots were describing what they had experienced. The engineers were interpreting what the aircraft was reporting. Those two pictures were not the same. Neither side was ignoring the problem. Neither side had the complete answer. The crew had restored electrical power. What they still had not restored was confidence in the situation. And that uncertainty would shape the decision that followed. The aircraft was flyable, but the crew had to answer a harder question. Was flyable the same as safe? The captain now faced the most important decision of the flight. The aircraft was responding, communication had returned, and many systems were available again. From the outside, the emergency appeared to be under control. Inside the cockpit, uncertainty remained. The crew still had incomplete information about the electrical system. Some functions had not returned to normal, and they could not be certain whether another failure could appear without warning. For the captain, the choice was not simply between continuing and turning back. It was between accepting uncertainty and removing it while he still had the option. Continuing toward Budapest would mean carrying that uncertainty hundreds of miles across Europe. Returning to Heathrow meant bringing the aircraft back to a familiar environment while the situation was still manageable. A decision made from incomplete information could either protect the passengers or expose them to another unknown. The captain chose the safer option. The flight turned back toward London. During the return, the crew continued monitoring abnormal indications while preparing for the approach. They managed remaining faults, communicated with controllers, and carefully reviewed their landing plan. The aircraft was stable, but the workload was higher than normal. There was no dramatic loss of control, no sudden collapse, just a professional crew making careful decisions with incomplete information. After landing safely at Heathrow, the aircraft became the focus of a much larger question. The pilots had brought the airplane home, but investigators still needed to discover how a modern aircraft designed with layers of protection had allowed one hidden fault to remove so much information from the people flying it. After the aircraft landed safely at Heathrow, the flight was no longer just an unusual event experienced by one crew. It became a question for investigators, engineers, and aviation experts. How could a modern aircraft, designed with layers of protection and backup systems, suddenly leave its pilots with so little reliable information? The investigation eventually revealed that the Airbus A319 had not suffered a complete loss of electrical power. Instead, a fault within the aircraft's electrical distribution system created a chain of effects that removed access to multiple systems at the same time. The aircraft was still flying. The pilots still had control, but they had temporarily lost something almost as important as control itself: confidence in the information around them. That became the central lesson of Flight 38. Modern aircraft rely on complex systems to make flying safer. These systems monitor, communicate, and guide crews through thousands of decisions every day. But when those systems fail in unexpected ways, technology alone cannot solve the problem. The final layer of safety remains the people operating the aircraft. The crew of Flight 38 did not succeed because they immediately discovered the cause. They succeeded because they recognized what they did not know. They evaluated the information available, managed the uncertainty, and made the decision that gave them the safest outcome. Flight 38 was not remembered because an aircraft failed. It was remembered because, when the aircraft could no longer clearly explain itself, the crew still knew how to listen, evaluate, and decide. The systems had become uncertain. The people operating them had not.